Hello there, my name is Cog, or Cognitive Bard, and this is episode 2 of our D&D series, following the adventures of a group we called the Breakfast Club. If you're watching these in order, there should be little need to go into too much detail about what's happened so far. But just to recap, essentially we have a group of 3, all of which were introverted and avoiding interaction with people for various reasons. Some of which were in character, and some of which were because they were all very new to the game and a little bit socially anxious, but moving on. They found themselves fighting alongside each other as their train is blown into the cavern by a horde of goblins. And this is where we'll continue, but we're going to take a step over to another story for a moment. The story of Faeril and Pono. The elf and her dwarven companion trod quietly along the winter-swept railroad, often keeping their hoods up and rarely addressing fellow travellers as they moved. Faeril had little patience for the folk of the overland, and although she bore the blue sparkling eyes, the soft milky skin, and the bright golden hair of a high elf maiden, she was in fact a drow. Behind the glamour she had skin as grey as the clouds before the thunder, gleaming garnet eyes, and hair as white as snow. Perhaps the most striking feature were the scars striping her face, something common among her people. Travelling with her was a dwarven companion, Pono, who wasn't your typical dwarf, but he wasn't as concerned with being recognised as Faeril, and so wore little more than a cloak to disguise his true identity as a Jirigar. Following close behind them was a purple ball of fur named Goblin. Small in stature, this creature was a displacer cub that Faeril had become curiously attached to. This unusual pet was generally kept out of sight for his own protection. Common folk wouldn't appreciate his uniqueness. As they'd travel, he'd often be ahead in the woods, pouncing on unsuspecting prey, anything smaller than he was, which he could swallow in more or less 3 bites. In the world beneath, blood and soul were the main currency, and in this regard Faeril was a stoic businesswoman. She hunted for trophies, ivories and pelts that would grant her fame and notoriety among her people. And having the ability to walk upon the surface was a particularly useful skill in this endeavour. Pono had been a humble ferryman who moved grog from one deep port to another, until one day he found himself in a darkened realm of death and decay. It was only with Faeril's help that he managed to survive his experiences there and return, losing his boat in the process. Still, loss aside, he owed Faeril his life, and they made a good team. They were journeying north to a mining colony called Thordrin's Enclave. Faeril had intel which suggested it was about to be accosted by rodent-esque creatures being led by her target, an albino rat named Bloodsplitter. The journey had taken them over a week on foot. They were very close now. They had reached a bridge which crossed over a large ravine a few hours before nightfall. It was storming quite intensely, and they had noticed small figures which they had just picked to be goblins, meddling with the support structures of the bridge. Tired enough to want a short rest anyways, they decided to sit back and watch the goblins from a distance. Night bathed the mountains in nearly pitch darkness, though both Pono and Faeril could still see in flawless monochrome. The goblins had finished their work and were waiting. Soon, echoing through the storm, there was a clanking, and following that, there were tiny signs of light. These lights grew bigger, and the sound grew louder as the unlocked train made its way towards the bridge. Neither Pono nor Faeril had ever seen a train before. They'd only heard about it in stories, and it was very impressive. A giant chunk of metal spun about the front of the carriage. Cogs and spindles allowed the wheels to pull forward along the line. It was truly a marvel of dwarven and gnomish engineering. Yet, in the literal moments, with a boom and a crash, and metal rending from metal, it was off the tracks and halfway down the ravine. The goblins had blown the bridge at precisely the moment the train was crossing. Only the caboose carriage had survived, and even that looked like it could slide down at any moment. What a pity. Faerul said coldly. Lots of valuables that will never be. She was cut off when suddenly the caboose door slid open. Goblins began swarming in as people were leaping out to meet them. An agile figure cut their way through, coming out seemingly unscathed. And then there was a curious winged figure. He flew up and started firing beams of bright energy at the ones mounted upon spiders. More and more of the little monsters were crawling and dashing towards them. The surviving passengers were going to be overwhelmed. Want to help them? Pono suggested. They could be useful. If not, they could be a little tastier than the rations we have. Faerul ignored the casual cannibalism of the Duergar and nodded her head. They have some skills. Perhaps some extra muscle couldn't hurt. And with that, Pono nodded and rushed towards the nearest target. Faerul knocked an arrow and began turning goblins into pincushions. Almost every one expertly found its mark, even in the rain and the darkness. Pono wrestled with spiders, his axe splitting and cleaving limbs. There was a crack of thunder. One of the survivors had channeled powerful magics and melted her enemies in the process. The remaining assailants cowered and retreated. Faerul was impressed, and perhaps slightly startled. A pair of mages and a dexterous fighter. These were indeed potential assets. As the survivors were catching their breath, Faerul sent her little cub ahead, being the first to greet them. She always found it amusing how startling people found her pet. That is remarkably disturbing, commented Moran, as Goblin the cub chirped at him, with hungry little golden eyes that reflected every tiny flash of light. He angled his aim towards the large cat when Faerul stepped from the shadows. She was also holding a bow with an arrow gently ready. She didn't get a chance to speak, though, as an arrow found the perfect gap in her armor. Moran had wasted no time, already preparing another. Ouch! She cried out in mild disbelief as the strangers began accosting her with questions. Who are you? Moran demanded. My name is Faerul. This is my pet, Goblin. She adjusted her posture as she prepared to snap the arrow. You should be more grateful! Yarg! She cried out. She failed to snap it properly and instead tore the whole thing. My companion and I just assisted you with your little goblin problem here. You ought to be a little bit less twang-happy. Your companion? Questioned Ileana, who had been fairly silently standing in a guarded stance. Faerul turned to the darkness as a mud and blood-covered dwarf holding an ornate axe was trudging up to join them. Pono Mountaintoe is his name. We're hunters, Faerul explained as she pressed on her wound. Moran lowered his bow and glanced at Ileana for a moment, then back to Faerul and Pono. Moran Genghis, at your service, he said, in a deceptively polite tone. I apologize for shooting you, but you should be more careful introducing yourself next time. His eyes turned to Goblin. That thing is frightening. Yes, he is. That's why he's mine. It was at this point that she noticed the winged man was not present. Weren't there, 3 of you? The question was immediately followed by the sound of cursing and bumping about as the caboose started to shift and slide towards the edge of the cliff. Moments before it plummeted, a dragonborn leapt out, with a flap of his wings, coddling something precious within his arms. As he stood up out of the muck, he adjusted his robe. Hello, everyone, he remarked, in a failed attempt to sound casual. Close call, that, Hastor said as he turned and heard the caboose make its final splash at the bottom of the ravine. Ileana moved to stand next to Hastor as she looked over the edge and examined what remained of the bridge. Close indeed, my friend, said Moran. That must have been something incredibly valuable that you went to retrieve. Hastor nodded with a disconcerting and toothy grin. My beehive, he said, showing it off from under his cloak. It keeps Seraphina and her companions nice and warm in any kind of weather. He stroked it as if it were a child, and then noticed Faerul and Pono. More survivors? He questioned. Farrell shook her head. No, we're hunters. We were merely passing through and saw that you needed help. Though, it seems you were doing fine without us. You all have some skills. I'm quite impressed. There were muttered responses of thanks from all three of the individuals. I could use skills like yours in my current hunt if you're not going anywhere in particular. Farrell paused for a moment and then decided to add, there would be a great deal of money in it if you were all willing to help. The promise of coin seemed to perk up the attention of Moran. She spent the next 15 minutes talking with these strangers about the hunt, asking and answering questions. At one point there was a pause as Ileana used her druidic powers to heal Farrell's wound. Beautiful foamy bubbles burst up around the area and left barely a hint of a scar. After a short time, and with the storm showing no signs of letting up, the strangers agreed that if nothing else it would be good to find some shelter, so the group became companions and followed the strange elf up the mountain pass, twisting and winding. It was a silent journey, with only the words of Farrell leading the way and the sounds of thunder and wind to break the awkwardness. After hours of climbing and trudging, they passed by some dwarven ruins, various mountainside homes that had been burned or abandoned. Upon crossing a bridge which overlooked the wreck site from which they'd just come, they were greeted with finely carved pillars that offered some protection from the rain. Beyond was a long and dark hall with art and symbols in beautiful detail lining all of the walls, yet again in Dwarvish. This was the entrance to the Enclave. In the mud, by the door, goblinoid corpses lay, each one a cold lump covered in dark, gunky blood. It seemed they'd been trying to run away, but in the process, they had been unalived. The bodies were fresh enough to call for some concern. The group deducted that the injuries were not made by dwarvish weapons. For Farrell, this was a good sign that she was on the right track. Within the entrance passage, the group set up fire and made camp, keeping dry and warm as the storm raged on. Farrell explained that the creature that they were hunting would likely already be below, and that they should begin their descent at first sign of morning. During that night, they came to know each other a little better. Hastor recognized Ileana for her works as a writer and paid his respects. She explained that she was seeking stories for her new book, and that was the main reason she'd agreed to come along on this adventure. Hastor happily offered to make the story interesting. As ominous as that sounded, Ileana graciously accepted the offer. Sometimes, strange folk lead to the best tales. Neither Hastor nor Moran shared much about why they were travelling south, and it didn't take a nat 20 in insight to know that they were hiding things. But nobody in this group seemed to care. Money and adventures were ahead for all, and that's all that mattered. The group awoke to the sound of humming and buzzing from the corridor ahead. Investigating this, they found that Hastor was sitting in an almost trance-like state, his hive strapped over his back, and occasionally a bee would clamber out and join an amassing swarm that bumbled about like a cloud. A vicious cloud. Farrell pulled her sack over her shoulder and stood next to Hastor. This is a complete inconvenience, and it's blocking the way. What the fuck, man? Hastor's draconic eyes flickered out of whatever trance he had been in, and he embarrassingly stuttered an apology as he stood up and walked over, creating a path through the swarm for all to follow. Farrell sighed in a way that could only be recognized as her rethinking the decision to bring these strangers along, and the party all stepped down the hall. They entered an iron elevator, prepared to descend into the Enclave. So here we finish episode 2, and this is actually where our first session ended. I thought it would be better to split it up into 2 parts to give everyone an impression of the characters that these players have begun to build. The session was overall quite fun, and everyone seemed to get along fairly well. Any awkward silences that the group had felt pretty natural given the chaotic and criminal nature of the personas that were being played here. I had, as a GM, tried to balance out encounters with some combat and some RP, with plans to later throw some puzzles in as well. Basically, I wanted a balanced first experience for all my new players. Anyways, join us next time as we learn more about the Breakfast Club. Explore the once lively enclave now tainted by the albino rat and his minions. Thanks for watching, everyone. Like, subscribe, doobly-doos, I don't know, all that fun stuff. And yeah, we'll see you next time.